developed an independent style that you can see in his self-portrait on the left. He was showing a strong dependence on one of the most avant-garde movements and one of the most progressive painters of his day, and that would be Gustave Courbet, who was the leader of the movement Realism, who committed himself to painting only objects visible and tangible to the painter. Nothing else, nothing imaginary, nothing historical, nothing from the past, nothing foreign or exotic that the artist didn't actually see himself. And so you can see the similarity of the self-portrait, an early self-portrait by Courbet, and Whistler's self-portrait with that broad-brimmed hat looking rather dramatic. And we are fortunate to have in the Columbus Museum of Art an early work around 1850 by Gustave Courbet called The Knife Grinders, typical of Courbet's subject matter, the working class. He championed the everyday middle and working class. And this painting, which has long been in storage, was recently hung by a great Liechtenstein fellow, Danny Marcus. It's hanging in the hallway in the level above us between galleries 1 and 2, if you're interested in looking at the real thing. And then continuing the comparison with Courbet and Whistler's early work, you see him on the right, Whistler, and if I don't have an artist's name, that means it's by Whistler, a scene along the Thames River, showing a working class neighborhood, Wapping, along the river that runs through London. This kind of proletarian environment with dark earth tone colors, very similar to a rustic table scene by Gustave Courbet. Whistler working about a decade later, and a thick, heavy brushwork. So that's the early style of the artist. Also, sometimes views simply of the river or buildings, townscapes, cityscapes with no figures in the compositions, like this gray and silver old Battersea Reach that's an oil painting in the Art Institute of Chicago. And notice at this point, by the early 60s, he's calling it, his primary title is Gray and Silver. The secondary title identifies the location. And then here's his first real success, or we could say, as the French do, a succès de scandale, a scandalous success, centered around the painting that I've identified as the so-called white girl. It was his mistress, his girlfriend, Jo Heffernan, who was a model that modeled for a number of artists, including Courbet. This was a painting which was rejected by the annual exhibitions of the Royal Academy in London, the annual Paris Salon, the state-sponsored exhibitions that were surveys of contemporary painting held each year. So it was exhibited in the notorious Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Refused of 1863, which was an exhibition of all the paintings that were rejected by the official Paris Salon. So many things troubled critics and visitors about this. First of all, why is it a symphony? Why does he call it Symphony in White? Well, it's about different shades and textures of white, the dress, the curtain, the fur rug. Why is she wearing a white dress, which is normally associated with innocence and virginity, but yet her hair is unbound and down along her shoulders, which means the opposite of virginity. So there seems to be a contradiction in visual coding there. And the loss of innocence is also indicated by the flowers on the rug. The fallen flowers on the ground are often indications of promiscuous or some kind of moral transgression. And then the style. It is two-dimensional. There's a flatness, a suppression of the illusion of volume. So there are elements in terms of the way he thought of the title. It's about color, different shades of white, the formal elements, the flatness that indicate that he was thinking in abstract terms. And the reason I'm showing it along with Luncheon on the Grass is that this avant-garde painting by Edouard Manet was the most notorious and famous painting that was exhibited in the Salon des Ouvriers. Many considered it, not surprisingly, more troubling than Whistler's painting, because there is this unexplained presence of a nude woman in the presence of the clothed men. There's an even stronger denial of three-dimensionality with the flatness. The model in the nude is not idealized. And there's as with the white girl, the question, what is going on? What is the painting about? You don't have, it's even more puzzling in the example by Manet than by Whistler. And so now this, I didn't, let's see, the next painting that I show you is the work that caused so much consternation in terms of the court battle that Whistler raised. Nocturne in Black and Gold, Falling Rocket, the outdoor nocturnal scene was audacious, was daring, bold in terms of its technique, in terms of the concept, the artist thinking of it in formal terms and titling it as such. And like the white girl, it perplexed viewers. For example, in the case of Whistler's Symphony in White, it flew in the face of traditional paintings that Victorian audiences, 19th century British audiences were used to. For example, in this work by Philip Calderon called Broken Vows, it's a full-length portrait of a woman, but there is a story that goes along with it that makes it understandable, and there's a moral lesson, there's a clear mood. We feel sorry for this lady. This is so sad. She is engaged, but yet her sweetheart is carrying on with another woman. And she's eavesdropping. She can hear, she can see a glimpse of the man, of her fiancé, of the other woman, and she's despondent. The title, Broken Vows, says it all. And on the other hand, we're not given any clue about what to think or what the meaning of the work on the left is, and there doesn't seem to be any moral underpinning of the work. Moreover, the technique of the work on the right is very detailed and leaves little, if anything, to the imagination in terms of delineating every square inch of the figures and environment in which are depicted by the artist. And then finally, the reason I didn't get this slide from another lecture mixed up with this talk, but the reason I'm showing you this 20th century abstraction by a British artist, Ben Nicholson, is that one reason that art historians are particularly give Whistler his due in terms of taking an important place towards the progression of modern art towards total abstraction is the fact that even though he worked in a representational manner, his technique, his style, his concept, his aesthetic led the way to non-representational art. Whistler's thinking of shapes, but he's still representing figures. If you just take the shapes and eliminate the images, recognizable figures, people, places, and things, the result is a work like the one on the right. Another important influence that helped define the artist's style is Asian art, the art of Japan, in particular. So in this work, this is Jo again, and it shows her with Japanese porcelain. There was a craze for Asian paraphernalia, screens, pottery, ceramic ware, clothing, robes, kimonos, and such, finding their way into Victorian interiors. And the aesthetics of Asian ceramics found their way into other paintings, like another Symphony Number 2. This is the little white girl, but the model now against a mirror, but with the addition of these of an Asian fan and an Oriental vase. And the resemblance to Japanese prints is particularly striking. The flatness, the two-dimensionality, the asymmetry, the importance of pattern over the two-dimensional surface come into play and are especially evident in making this kind of comparison. So back to Falling Rocket and the lawsuit. Okay, as promised, Whistler v. Ruskin, the work in question. The trial took place in 1878 in London. It only lasted 2 days, and the defendant was John Ruskin, a critic who wrote a hostile review in this relatively obscure art journal, and he was sued. Whistler expected to collect £1,000. And here is his nemesis, John Ruskin, who was a critic and artist himself. Here's a self-portrait of Ruskin and the typical kind of subject matter and style that Ruskin produced. He was also a geologist, a scientist, a theoretician, and he had very strong views about what he thought art could and should be. He thought that modern art like that of Whistler was detrimental to civilization, and thought that art should have a moral. He was particularly attracted to pre-Raphaelite art, an example of which you see in the lower left, Christ in the House of His Parents by Sir John Everett Millais. This was an artistic movement that was a reform movement that sought to take art back to the period before the Renaissance, when art was supposedly more honest and had more integrity, and a pre-Raphaelite art, not exclusively, but most often depicted historical subjects. And even Ruskin depicts not something in England, not something real like the subjects of Whistler, but something that to a British person would be foreign. So the trial took 2 days, as I said, and it involved a number of paintings that were brought in as evidence, such as Old Battersea Bridge, Nocturne in Blue and Gold, subtitle, Old Battersea Bridge. And then this portrait is Arrangement in Black, number 3. This was an actor in costume, Sir Henry Irving. And when Whistler was on the stand, he shocked many of his listeners when he described a nocturne as an arrangement of line, form, and color, rather than a picture of a bridge and so on, the notion of formalism being very unfamiliar. And this notion of arrangement in black and gray for Whistler's defense to emphasize the importance and the validity of a formalist aesthetic. He could have, but they didn't bring in the portrait of the artist's mother as another example, since it is Arrangement in Gray and Black is the primary title. And so here is a cartoon that depicts the outcome of the trial. Whistler won, but it was we'd say a Pyrrhic victory, an illusory victory, because he only won a farthing, less than a penny. And the cost of the trial left him in major financial trouble. These snakes, these poisonous snakes on the bottom, are labeled costs. And then the caption on the bottom says, "Naughty critic to use such bad language," because Ruskin called Whistler a coxcomb, which is apparently very risque, and silly painter to go to law about it. And then Ruskin is depicted as an old bird with a long beak that says, "Old pelican in the art wilderness." And then Whistler is shown with his back turned with his famous curly hair. He had some nickname when he was in school, something like Curly Top. He was notorious for his curly head of hair. But at any rate, the cartoon points out that this really had severe financial impact on Whistler. Rust can really cause him financial damage, and he went bankrupt after the trial. He eventually had to sell his house and his contents. After the 1870s, he didn't complete very many large oil paintings. He destroyed a number of works. Many paintings went unfinished. And he worked primarily on prints and drawings, works on paper. He wrote a book about it all called The Gentle Art of Making Enemies. He did, he did go to Venice. He was happily commissioned to make a set of prints in Venice. It was a welcome assignment to help him recoup his losses. Unhappily, they didn't sell very well, but his Venice trip resulted in watercolors like the one on top, and then the print on the bottom, Nocturne Palaces, is from the Syracuse University Art Collection. And I've talked to a number of people who, unlike me, but I want to see it before it closes, have seen the Whistler exhibition that's at the Zanesville Museum of Art, An American in Venice, James McNeill Whistler and His Legacy, that consists of prints or works on paper from the Syracuse University Art Collection. And then he also, in order, again, to make money that is not to impugn his artistic integrity, because a kind of art is remunerative, doesn't mean that it's any less sincere or valid, but he returned to sets of prints along the Thames River because earlier those had sold well. So this is one example of, we've got 12 prints, miscellaneous prints that came in from various sources over the years, but this is one print by Whistler of the Thames that was produced after the trial. And unfortunately, we have old master prints on view at the present time, but Whistler is a modern artist, so we don't have any of his prints on view at present. So just winding up his, one of his later works, one of his few full-length portraits, you see of the woman who was his wife in the last decades of his life. This was his final relationship. He'd broken up with Jo long ago. There was another woman or women in between. But this is Trixie, Beatrice Trixie Goodwin, who he married in 1888. He was 55, she was 32. He moved with her to Paris. He bounced back from his troubled years, at least for a time. And this is appropriately called, along with his formalist titles, Harmony in Red, Lamplight. But sadly, the happiness was brief. His wife, his beloved Trixie, died of cancer and spent her final months injected with morphine, which, even though this sounds like it has a happy title, The Siesta, this is Beatrix dying. And notice this very minimal use of ink and line that characterizes much of his work on paper. He achieved with etchings, lithographs, drawings, great effect with minimal lines or washes. So the death of his wife at 39 left him heartbroken, and he died 6 years later. But I do want to end on a happy note. Here's another full-length portrait from his later years, 1894, of a lawyer and collector of modern art, a lawyer from Chicago, Arthur Jerome Eddy. The title, Arrangement in Flesh, Color, and Brown. The subtitle, Arthur Jerome Eddy. And this Chicago lawyer sought out Whistler while he was in Paris because he had seen Whistler's work in the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, the World's Columbian Exhibition. So this painting was done abroad a year later. And it was Arthur Jerome Eddy who was responsible for largely responsible for bringing the Armory Show, which is a very important exhibition of modern art, huge exhibition, introduced many Americans for the first time. thousands of Americans saw abstract art and were exposed to it for the first time when the show was in New York and Boston. But Arthur Jerome Eddy brought it to us. He brought it to the Midwest, and it was at the Art Institute of Chicago. He collected modern art as well, and so many of his great modern artworks are in the Art Institute of Chicago, like this one, Kandinsky's improvisation number 30, Canons. And this, you might say, is another example of the final steps of the path that Whistler led the development of avant-garde painting towards the more total committed artists that were abstract painters. So that the musical title, Improvisation number 30, it follows through with Whistler's idea of connecting art and music, titling it as such, and making very clear his intentions and his aesthetics. So with these images, I conclude. Thank you for listening, and we can all look forward to a great performance of the art of British composer Edward Elgar. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Wasn't that wonderful? He's just the smartest man in Columbus right here. And I like to embarrass him. Well, they're setting up the stage. I'm just going to give you a few words. My name is Daniel Walshaw. I'm a vice president with the Columbus Symphony. And as David says, this program is related to a concert we're doing next week where we're performing Elgar's, probably one of his greatest works, which is his Enigma Variations. And they're called the Enigma Variations because there's this theme that music historians have kind of wondered about for ages, about what exactly where did this come from? They can't figure out where he placed it, where did he pick it from. We think it might be related to the overture, which is by Mendelssohn on the first half of the concert, but I'll let you guys who love to do crosswords like me, I'm assuming, because everyone does crosswords, you can figure it out for yourselves. But it's really an amazing concert. Chopin's first piano concerto by a brilliant pianist with us. And then the week after, we're doing the Messiah over at the Southern Theater, and we even have a 2 p.m. matinee concert on Sunday, so you can go to church in the morning and then go to more church in the afternoon, and you'll just be loaded up with church all that day. So thank you so much. Please pick up our brochures. It'll tell you all about the upcoming concerts, and as soon as the musicians of our great orchestra come out, they're going to tell you a little bit about what they're playing, which is going to be a set of short pieces by Elgar that were written quite early in his life, and he's a wonderful, wonderful, tuneful composer, so I hope you enjoy.
Hi, welcome. That was a very interesting lecture by David Stark. I thought it was interesting that Whistler named most of his paintings after almost musical ideas. Um, and it's interesting that Algar named some of his pieces after people, sort of the opposite. Um, these little ditties, I will call them, they're almost like sketches when you saw a few of Whistler's sketches up there, because they're very short little pieces. And this was a young composer who was self-taught. Elgar grew up in a modest middle-class English family, and so that they didn't have money to send him to school, but his father owned a music shop and was a repairman for organs around the area. And as you can imagine, before TV and recordings and cell phones, for entertainment, people would often get together and play music or sing together. Um, so Elgar and his brothers grew up in kind of a musical environment, exposed to music, and got to meet quite a few musicians at his father's shop. But he basically taught himself to compose, and then had studied some violin and piano and organ. Actually became quite a good violinist. Apparently was told he was good enough to become a soloist. But back then, the England was much more class conscious, and so coming